Hundreds of thousands of people are kidnapped every year. The majority are found relatively quickly, but some are not returned to their families for years or even decades. Of those who remain missing for long periods of time, we often hear about small children taken by those who raise them as their own. While definitely wrong, there is a little comfort in knowing the child wasn't mistreated. Unfortunately, not all kidnapping cases are like this, and many victims spend years or decades in horrible conditions before escaping or being rescued. These are 5 cases where people were held captive for years. Number 5. Brian Keenan was 30 years old when he decided he wanted a change of scenery from his life in Belfast, Ireland. He'd previously been a teacher and enrolled at a local university, but found himself out of a job in the mid-80s and surrounded by friends moving into a different stage of their lives. He applied to work as an English teacher at the American University in Lebanon and was accepted. At the start of 1986, he traveled to begin his tenure. He stayed in a villa about a 10-minute walk from the university, and it was while on this walk on April 11th that he was bundled into the back of an old Mercedes by 4 gunmen. It was the start of a 4.5-year ordeal. Brian had been kidnapped by a fundamentalist and held hostage. He was traveling on both British and Irish passports, so it's likely that these individuals believed he was British. The kidnapping was one of more than 100 which took place during the Lebanon hostage crisis. Politics in the area were complicated, but most of the motivation behind the kidnappings comes down to the perpetrators wanting the US and Western allies out of the situation. At the time, the US and Britain's policy was to not negotiate with hostage takers. And while the Irish government did try to get Brian freed, they were met with little success. Brian was held in isolation for several months, kept in a dark, rat-infested cell. He was only given 1 meal and 1 bottle of water a day. He was later held with the British journalist John McCarthy, who'd been captured at roughly the same time as him. They were moved to several different locations throughout Lebanon, all the time with chains on their wrists and feet. Over 4.5 years, Brian got to know his captors quite well and understood their cause. In 1990, Brian was released after negotiations between Iran and the kidnappers took place. He's since gone on to write multiple books, the most notable of which being the account of his time in activity, called An Evil Cradling. Number 4. Maria Monaco was kept in a locked room in her family home for 18 years before being rescued in 2008. Maria, from a small town just outside of Naples, Italy, had been 29 years old when she fell pregnant outside of wedlock in 1990. The family wasn't particularly well off, but held respectable jobs. Her brother was a farmer and her sister was a school teacher. The thought of Maria having a child outside of marriage was not something the family could get on board with, especially as Maria refused to tell them who the father was. Maria was locked in a room on the 2nd floor of the 2-story house, with access to only a small washroom. It was here that she gave birth to her son, but the ordeal didn't end there for Maria. While the family were accepting of the boy, Maria was made to remain in the room for the next 17 years. Police were contacted by a neighbor who complained about a smell coming from the house. There, they found Maria in a terribly dirty bedroom. She was surrounded by excrement and cigarette butts. The only washroom she had access to was filthy and could not be used. She could barely walk, and police described her speech as more like wailing. Maria's brother, sister, and mother were arrested, though they argued her captivity wasn't due to her pregnancy. According to family lawyers, Maria was held in the room as she was mentally ill. Maria definitely did have mental health problems and had been receiving disability checks the entire time she was imprisoned. According to the family, the reason why the conditions were so bad was because Maria refused to let them come in and clean her or her surroundings. Her son, who lived with relatives, was also aware of the situation and was told she was too sick for visits. The family's lawyers pointed out the boy was accepted by Maria's mother and siblings and suggested that that should count for something. Whether Maria was kept in the room as a punishment for her pregnancy or her mental health, there's no denying it should not have happened. When asked why the family didn't get doctors involved, their lawyer said they were simply ashamed. Many also questioned why the authorities didn't check in on Maria sooner. Number 3. Ingrid Betancourt is a Colombian anti-corruption politician who was held hostage by Marxist guerrillas for 6 years. Ingrid wasn't unfamiliar with being attacked and received so many death threats in her early career that she sent her children and their father to New Zealand for a time to keep them safe. Despite the threats, she didn't back down and continued to fight against corruption. In 1998, she founded her own political party, the Oxygen Green Party, and 4 years later, she represented the party as she ran for president. It was while campaigning that opportunistic soldiers working for the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia kidnapped her and her assistant, Clara Rojas. In February of 2002, Ingrid was scheduled to appear in a remote village called San Vincent, deep within a zone controlled by her enemies. It was a dangerous trip. She'd been set to travel by military helicopter, but at the last minute, her place was canceled. Rather than giving up, Ingrid and her assistant traveled by car. They ran into a roadblock where they were approached by soldiers. Ingrid, who was the daughter of 2 prominent politicians herself, knew the signs to look out for and knew these were not the National Army. She and Clara were taken deep into the rainforest to a camp where they would remain for the next 6 years. The 2 women weren't alone at the camp. There were dozens of other hostages, including 3 US military contractors, who were captured after their plane crashed nearby. Unsurprisingly, conditions in the camp were mixed. Some of the guards were generally not kind. One even taught Ingrid how to weave belts, and the prisoners were permitted books and a radio that occasionally got reception. Of course, there was also the constant threat of beatings and death, as every guard carried a weapon and severe beatings were handed out to anybody who stepped out of line. At various points over the years, the prisoners turned on one another. Ingrid and Clara fell out many times, particularly after one escape attempt in which Ingrid felt Clara had started their rations too early. Other prisoners thought Ingrid was a troublemaker. She refused to answer to her number during roll call, even though her other prisoners thought she would get them all in trouble. In 2008, a helicopter landed into the camp. Soldiers told the guards they were there to transport prisoners to another location. Ingrid and 14 other hostages boarded the helicopter. Once it took off, the soldiers revealed they were actually from the Colombian military and this was a rescue. Ingrid was reunited with her 2 children and has since left Colombian politics. Number 2. Fusako Sato disappeared in 1990 while walking home from a baseball game at her school in Japan when she was 9 years old. For years, friends and family searched for Fusako, but it was as if she had disappeared into thin air. In 1996, a 73-year-old woman contacted the local public health center about her son, Sato. Sato was acting strangely and violent towards her. She'd been banned from his bedroom on the 2nd floor of their home since he'd been a schoolboy, and things seem to have only escalated since then. It's not certain if anything was done at the time, but in 2000, the elderly woman contacted the health center again. Officials tried to investigate the house, but Sato reacted badly, and the police had to be called. January 19, 2000, the police searched the home, where they found 19-year-old Fusako locked in Sato's bedroom. Fusako explained she'd been kidnapped at knife point by a man while she was walking home from a baseball game. He'd forced her into the back of his car before driving 60 miles back to his home. At first, her hands and feet were bound together with tape, and Fusako was banned from touching the door to the room she was being kept in. He cut her hair short and would not let her bathe or use the bathroom unless he could be certain that his mother, living downstairs, wouldn't see her. The whole time, his mother had no idea there was a 3rd person living in their home. Fusako had been beaten and had a stun gun used on her if she needed to be punished for any so-called crimes. This included things like not recording Sato's horse racing programs properly. At first, she wanted to escape, but she became too scared and physically weak. When she was rescued, Fusako was suffering from exhaustion jaundice, and her muscles had atrophied, making it hard for her to walk. Fusako tried to go back to live a normal life and helped out at the family farm. Meanwhile, Sato was given a 14-year prison sentence. Number 1. From the outside, the Turnpin family seemed like a happy, if slightly odd, family from Virginia. The parents posted photos of the family at Disneyland on social media. The outside of the house was neatly kept, and the neighbors occasionally saw the children playing outside. But these were only rare occasions of freedom for the 13 Turnpin children. Most of the time, they were kept locked in their bedroom, only permitted to leave for one meal a day, and were sometimes left shackled to their beds. David Turnpin was an engineer while his wife Louise was officially listed as a housewife. They met when Louise was 10 and David was 17, and eloped in 1985. 3 years later, they had their first child. Between 1988 and 2005, they would have a total of 13 children, 3 boys and 10 girls. At first, things didn't seem too bad. Louise's sister stayed with the family for a time in 1998, and later said she thought they had a strict parenting style, but nothing too severe. The following year, they moved to Fort Worth, Texas, and it appears to be here where things started to get really bad. The strict parenting turned to neglect, which turned into torture. The children were beaten, strangled, and starved. When the Turnpins moved in 2010, the neighbors found feces and beds with ropes tied to them, as well as dead cats and piles of rubbish on the property. Despite this, and concerned family members noticing how thin the children appeared to be in photos, it would be another 8 years before anything was done. On January 14, 2018, 2 of the girls put into action a plan they'd been putting together for 2 years. The 13-year-old and 17-year-old escaped through a window. The younger sister became scared and turned back, while the older sister got away from the house before contacting police on an old cell phone. The house was raided, and police found the 12 other children, one of which was still shackled to a bed, and 2 others had only been recently freed. Even though 7 were over the age of 18 and legally adults, they were so malnourished that they looked like minors. David and Louise were arrested and later sentenced to life in prison. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.